In 1998, aboard Royal Caribbean's Rhapsody of the Seas, a Caribbean voyage moved steadily through open water, where structured routines, crowded decks, and enclosed corridors created the illusion of complete continuity within a self-contained world at sea, until one passenger's presence quietly slipped beyond the boundaries of what could later be fully accounted for. What remained was not a clear sequence of events, but fragmented points preserved within an environment that was never designed to hold a complete record of human movement. Years later, the case would resurface through scattered claims and 3 separate sightings that refused to align into a single explanation, pulling the disappearance back into focus without resolving the uncertainty at its core. As you move through the details that follow, the investigation opens through incomplete records, conflicting recollections, and distant reports that blur the line between memory and possibility, leaving only a narrowing space between what was seen, what was recorded, and what may still remain unconfirmed. The final departure from Royal Caribbean's Rhapsody of the Seas. The voyage of Royal Caribbean's Rhapsody of the Seas in March 1998 unfolded like countless other Caribbean sailings of its era, a carefully structured passage through warm trade winds and open water where days were measured less by urgency than by rhythm, meals served at fixed hours, music drifting through atriums and lounges, and passengers moving through a floating city designed to feel both expansive and contained at the same time. Built to accommodate thousands of guests and launched only a year earlier in 1997, the ship represented a modern standard of cruise travel, complete with entertainment venues, multiple decks of cabins, and a constant circulation of activity that blurred the line between public space and private retreat. Yet beneath the surface of that carefully maintained normalcy, the nature of such environments always carries a subtle contradiction, where isolation exists even in crowds, and where the vastness of the surrounding ocean quietly reinforces how far removed every passenger is from land-based certainty. Among the passengers aboard that sailing was Amy Bradley, a 23-year-old travelling with her family on what was intended to be a routine vacation through the Caribbean. The itinerary placed the ship between ports, including San Juan, Puerto Rico, and several island destinations such as Aruba and Curaçao, a route familiar to cruise operations in the region and designed to balance scenic stops with long stretches of open sea. For families like the Bradleys, the structure of the journey offered an unusual sense of safety, where movement was controlled, schedules were predictable, and the boundaries of the ship itself became the only geography that mattered. Amy, like many young passengers on board, was part of the visible life of the ship during its early days at sea, participating in social areas, attending entertainment events, and moving through spaces where passengers naturally overlapped without requiring introductions or formal connections. As the ship progressed deeper into its route, the internal environment of the Rhapsody of the Seas followed its expected pattern, with passengers gathering in lounges, attending live music performances, and spending evenings in nightclubs and open-deck spaces where ocean air mixed with artificial light and sound. It was within this setting that Amy was observed spending time in the ship's nightclub area, where a live band performed regularly for guests. Witnesses later described her dancing and interacting socially during the evening hours, a detail that would become one of the last widely referenced points of confirmed activity before the timeline surrounding her movements began to narrow. In such environments, where music and crowd density can blur individual presence into collective motion, memory often becomes fragmented, shaped by brief visual impressions rather than continuous observation. During that same period, Amy was also reportedly seen in connection with members of the ship's entertainment staff, including a musician from the onboard band, a detail that later became part of the broader investigative record. These accounts would be examined during subsequent inquiries, not as definitive conclusions, but as elements of reconstructed timelines based on passenger and crew recollections. Within the structured world of a cruise ship, where entertainment staff and passengers frequently share the same performance spaces, such interactions are not unusual in themselves, yet in hindsight they became focal points for investigators attempting to establish the last verifiable moments of consistent visibility. The ship's atmosphere at night, defined by layered sound, shifting crowds, and continuous movement between venues, meant that even notable interactions could pass without formal documentation unless captured by direct witness testimony. As dawn approached on the final morning before Amy's disappearance, the environment aboard the ship shifted into the quieter transitional phase, typical of early daylight hours at sea. Public areas gradually emptied, music ceased, and the ship entered a subdued state where only a small number of passengers remained awake, while most cabins were still occupied by sleeping guests. It was during this window that Amy was last confirmed to be aboard the vessel, with her presence placed within the family's cabin area on the upper decks. Her father later recounted seeing her on the balcony earlier that morning, a brief domestic moment that, at the time, carried no indication of anything unusual, existing instead as part of the ordinary rhythm of a family vacation at sea. The layout of cruise ship accommodations, particularly balcony cabins facing the ocean, creates a unique spatial relationship between interior privacy and external openness, where doors separate controlled climate and enclosed space from the vast, unstructured expanse of the sea. In the early morning hours, this contrast becomes even more pronounced, as daylight slowly replaces artificial lighting and the ocean remains largely undisturbed by human activity. It was within this transitional atmosphere that Amy's presence was last noted, in a manner consistent with routine observation rather than heightened awareness, reinforcing how easily ordinary moments aboard such a vessel can blend into the continuity of shipboard life without immediate recognition of their significance. As the morning continued and the ship moved steadily toward its next destination, the absence of any immediate sign of disruption preserved the illusion that everything remained within normal operational parameters. Crew routines began, passengers gradually awoke, and the vessel continued its course through the Caribbean waters, maintaining the structured progression that defines commercial cruise travel. It was only later, when Amy could no longer be located within the expected boundaries of the ship, that the earlier hours would be re-examined with increasing scrutiny, transforming ordinary moments into critical reference points in a timeline that had already begun to fracture in retrospect. What remained at that stage was not a clear indication of what had occurred, but rather a narrowing corridor of time framed by routine activity on one side and absence on the other, where the normal functioning of a modern cruise ship continued uninterrupted, while a single passenger's presence had already begun to fade from verifiable record. The ship continued its voyage through the Caribbean Sea, carrying thousands of passengers forward under the assumption that all routines remained intact, unaware that a quiet absence had already begun to take shape within the rhythm of its journey. The last confirmed moments before she vanished without a trace. What emerged from the fragmented recollections of that night was not a continuous sequence of events, but a series of disconnected moments later assembled into a timeline that never fully aligned into certainty, shaped instead by partial memory, inconsistent recall, and the inherent limitations of reconstructing movement within a vast enclosed environment at sea. In the aftermath, investigators were left with anchored points rather than a flowing narrative, each one separated by stretches of uncertainty where no continuous observation could reliably confirm what had occurred between them. This form of reconstruction is common in maritime investigations conducted after the fact, where the absence of uninterrupted recording forces reliance on human testimony and procedural logs that were never designed to capture every transitional moment between recorded observations. Within the recorded movements of passengers that evening, one of the earliest anchored points places Amy Bradley inside the ship's nightclub environment, where live music and shifting crowds formed a dense backdrop of overlapping activity aboard Royal Caribbean's Rhapsody of the Seas, a setting where individual presence often blended into collective motion under dim lighting and constant movement. The nature of such venues meant that visibility was intermittent by design, with guests moving between dance floors, seating areas, and adjoining corridors, creating a constant reconfiguration of who could be seen, remembered, or later identified with precision. In this kind of environment, even confirmed sightings often exist as snapshots rather than continuous tracking, preserved only through brief observational windows that depend heavily on timing, attention, and proximity rather than sustained monitoring. As a result, the nightclub becomes less a single fixed location in the narrative and more a shifting environment of overlapping perspectives. Across multiple later accounts gathered during the investigation, brief and inconsistent observations described her presence in proximity to members of the onboard entertainment staff, though these recollections never formed a fully unified sequence of interaction, instead existing as partial impressions shaped by environment, timing, and the natural limits of human recall in crowded social spaces at sea. Some accounts placed her in conversational proximity, while others described only brief visual confirmation within shifting groups of passengers, leaving investigators with fragments that suggested movement without establishing a stable chain of continuity. In a setting where social interaction is fluid and unrecorded, even meaningful moments can dissolve quickly into ambiguity once time begins to separate observation from verification. Investigators reviewing these statements were required to evaluate not only what was described, but also how the surrounding conditions of noise, lighting, and crowd density may have influenced the reliability of each recollection. Between the last clearly recalled sightings and the hours that followed, the record begins to fracture into intervals where movement cannot be continuously traced through either witness testimony or structured onboard monitoring, creating a narrowing corridor of time defined less by what is known than by what is missing from documentation. Cruise ship environments of the late 1990s did not operate with comprehensive surveillance coverage across all passenger access areas, meaning that reconstruction efforts relied heavily on human recollection, routine logs, and indirect indicators of presence rather than uninterrupted visual recording. This structural limitation introduced gaps that could not easily be resolved after the fact, especially once the passage of time further distanced memory from immediate observation. Within these gaps, investigators were left to infer continuity where none could be directly verified, producing a timeline that remains carefully ordered in appearance but inherently discontinuous in evidentiary substance. Eventually, the narrowing focus of the timeline settles on a final confirmed point within the ship's cabin area, where Amy was later placed through family testimony describing a brief and ordinary morning interaction, one that carried no indication of disruption and instead reflected the normal cadence of a shared vacation space gradually transitioning toward daytime activity. The simplicity of this moment, when viewed in hindsight, contrasts sharply with the investigative weight it later carried, as it became one of the final stable references before uncertainty began to dominate the sequence of events. At that time, however, nothing about the interaction suggested deviation from routine shipboard behaviour, which continued to unfold across the vessel without interruption. In retrospect, this moment functions less as a dramatic endpoint, and more as a final anchored reference point, against which all subsequent uncertainty is measured. By the time daylight had fully taken hold of the vessel's upper decks, shipboard routines had resumed their expected rhythm, with no immediate indication that any deviation from normal passenger presence had yet been recognised, allowing the disappearance to remain temporarily indistinguishable from ordinary spatial movement within a large and densely populated environment. Crew operations continued according to schedule. Passengers moved through breakfast services and deck areas, and the ship maintained its steady progression through the Caribbean waters, reinforcing the appearance of normalcy that often defines large-scale maritime travel. Only later would that same normalcy be reinterpreted through the absence it concealed. In such environments, continuity itself can become deceptive, as operational regularity may persist even while critical informational gaps quietly emerge within the underlying record of events. Only in the space between those ordinary routines and the absence that followed did investigators later begin to identify the first signs that the recorded sequence of the night had already begun to break apart. The overnight window, where surveillance and time records begin to break down. Operational continuity aboard the vessel persisted into the overnight hours, even as the traceable sequence of individual movement began to lose coherence within the underlying record structure, creating a situation where the ship itself continued functioning according to established procedures, while the ability to reconstruct uninterrupted human presence gradually weakened within the available points of reference. In maritime environments of this scale, especially during transoceanic travel, systems are designed primarily to ensure safety, navigation, and scheduled operations, meaning that the continuity of passenger location is often inferred indirectly, rather than actively tracked in real time across every internal passage of the vessel. As activity transitions from daytime density into overnight reduction, the informational environment of the ship changes fundamentally, not because movement ceases, but because the number of observable touchpoints capable of confirming that movement decreases significantly. Installed monitoring systems on cruise ships operating in the late 1990s were concentrated in select public areas, reflecting a design approach that prioritized venue oversight rather than continuous passenger tracking across the entire vessel, with surveillance coverage typically focused on high-traffic entertainment zones, entry points, and restricted operational spaces rather than private corridors or cabin-adjacent environments. This selective placement meant that visibility was inherently uneven, producing a network of observed spaces surrounded by areas that existed outside consistent recording range, a structural reality that shaped how movement could later be reconstructed when reviewing events after the fact. In practical terms, this created a vessel that was partially observable rather than fully monitored, where certain environments generated continuous documentation, while others existed only through indirect inference based on entry, exit, or witness passage. Movement within the ship's internal layout was divided by functional separation zones, where access corridors, service passages, and passenger routes intersected without being uniformly observed or continuously documented, allowing for natural circulation of thousands of individuals without requiring constant verification at every transition point. These architectural divisions were not unusual for vessels of this type, as they were designed to maintain operational efficiency and privacy, while supporting large-scale passenger capacity, yet they also introduced inherent observational discontinuities that only become significant when attempting to reconstruct specific sequences of movement within a narrow time window. During active hours, these gaps are rarely noticeable because human presence itself fills the continuity through frequent observation. During overnight hours, those same gaps expand as visual confirmation becomes increasingly sparse. Administrative logs maintained during overnight operations documented procedural activity rather than uninterrupted human presence, producing a record that confirmed routine function without necessarily preserving complete spatial continuity, meaning that what was formally recorded often reflected operational status, such as scheduled checks, crew duties, and system operations, rather than a comprehensive mapping of passenger positioning at every moment. In this way, the record functions more as an outline of ship behavior than a continuous narrative of individual movement, leaving interpretation dependent on the convergence of multiple indirect sources rather than a single continuous tracking system. The distinction between operational documentation and forensic continuity becomes especially significant in retrospect when investigators attempt to reconstruct human presence using records never intended for that level of resolution. As passenger activity diminished during the overnight cycle, the density of observational points naturally decreased, leaving extended intervals in which fewer independent confirmations of movement were available for reconstruction, a condition that emerges organically in environments where large populations transition into rest periods, while a smaller number of crew members maintain essential operations across distributed sections of the vessel. This reduction in observable activity does not indicate absence of movement itself, but rather a thinning of available reference points through which such movement could later be verified with precision. In effect, the ship enters a phase where spatial behavior continues uninterrupted, but evidentiary visibility declines, creating a widening separation between lived activity and recorded confirmation. Within this reduced observational environment, even ordinary transitions between spaces, corridors, decks, stairwells, and cabin areas become significantly harder to place within a continuous sequence, unless directly witnessed or indirectly recorded, meaning that routine mobility itself becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct in full detail once the overnight cycle progresses beyond peak activity hours. The investigative consequence of this condition is not immediate, because the absence of continuity is not apparent in real time. It only becomes visible when later attempts are made to align fragmented data points into a stable timeline. With the arrival of morning procedures, shipboard operations resumed their structured rhythm, yet the continuity of one passenger's presence could no longer be reconciled through the same observational framework that had governed earlier activity, as the transition from low-activity overnight conditions into structured daytime routines revealed a discontinuity that could not be bridged through existing records alone. Crew movement increased, public spaces reactivated, and scheduled operations resumed their normal cadence. But within that broader return to routine function, a single unresolved gap in continuity began to stand apart from the rest of the vessel's operational stability. What had been an indistinct absence during reduced activity hours now became structurally visible as an unaccounted point within an otherwise restored pattern of normal operations. When standard internal records failed to provide the continuity needed to resolve the growing gap, attention inevitably shifted outward toward coordinated search procedures that extended beyond the vessel itself, search operations at sea and the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. Recognition of the missing presence did not occur as a single decisive moment, but instead surfaced gradually through the accumulation of unverified positional checks that failed to resolve into confirmation, creating a procedural uncertainty that only became visible as routine shipboard movement continued without alignment to expected passenger accountability. In large-scale maritime environments, particularly aboard passenger vessels operating far from shore, absence is not immediately interpreted as a confirmed event, but as a discrepancy that must first pass through repeated verification points before it is formally acknowledged within operational structure. This reliance on layered confirmation reflects the inherent design of maritime accountability systems, where passenger presence is tracked through overlapping touchpoints such as accommodation records, activity participation, and scheduled service interactions, all of which must collectively fail to align before an absence is formally escalated into operational concern. Shipboard response protocols initiated a structured movement across designated passenger areas, where coordinated personnel began systematically checking cabins, public spaces, and transitional corridors for any trace of the unaccounted individual, following established procedures designed for locating missing persons within confined maritime spaces. These procedures rely on layered coverage of the vessel, dividing search responsibility across teams assigned to specific zones, ensuring that no accessible passenger area is left unexamined during the initial internal response phase. The scale of such vessels introduces inherent delays into even the most structured search operations, as vertical deck arrangements, interconnected corridors, and recreational environments require sequential verification rather than simultaneous clearance, creating a process that is comprehensive in design but necessarily distributed in execution. Ordinary patterns of onboard activity were quietly interrupted as passenger movement became indirectly influenced by search coordination efforts unfolding across multiple decks simultaneously, with announcements and personnel presence subtly reshaping how guests navigated shared spaces without fully halting the ship's operational continuity. While essential services remained active, the internal atmosphere shifted into a controlled state of uncertainty, where changes in crew positioning, restricted access points, and increased movement in previously routine areas signaled procedural adjustment, even without full public disclosure of details. This subtle disruption created a dual perception on board, where operational normalcy continued externally while internal coordination activity introduced visible but unexplained changes in spatial flow. Communication channels established with maritime oversight agencies introduced an external procedural layer to the situation, extending the operational framework beyond the vessel's internal command structure and linking it to broader reporting systems designed for incidents occurring in international waters. This escalation reflects standard maritime protocol, where internal incidents that cannot be immediately resolved through onboard verification are transmitted through structured communication pathways, connecting ship command with external authorities responsible for coordinating broader response awareness. These exchanges establish a parallel information stream in which internal search activity continues, while external acknowledgement begins to form, creating a layered investigative environment operating across different procedural domains. Preliminary internal interpretations of the situation remained constrained by limited verified information, with early assessments structured around procedural caution rather than immediate assumption, ensuring that conclusions were not formed ahead of full area clearance and log verification. Maritime operational practice requires that uncertainty be maintained within defined categories until physical and administrative checks are exhausted, meaning that even urgent anomalies are processed through controlled evaluative stages rather than immediate classification. This method preserves investigative integrity by preventing premature conclusions from influencing search direction before all accessible verification points have been examined. Navigation of the vessel continued according to its scheduled course, while internal response activity unfolded simultaneously, producing a divided operational state in which external maritime movement remained unaffected, while internal coordination efforts focused entirely on resolving the absence within the ship's controlled environment. This dual operational condition is a structural feature of maritime systems, where voyage continuity is maintained independently of internal administrative disruptions, allowing the vessel to proceed through open water even as localized response activity temporarily alters internal procedural flow. The resulting dynamic creates a separation between physical movement and investigative focus, with each operating under distinct functional requirements. As external reporting obligations expanded beyond the ship's immediate perimeter, the situation began transitioning from an internal operational concern into a developing multi-jurisdictional inquiry extending across surrounding maritime regions, expanding investigation across the Caribbean and early unverified leads. Once the vessel had moved beyond its final confirmed operational zones, the investigative scope began to extend outward into a scattered network of coastal reporting points and regional maritime oversight channels operating independently of one another, creating a widening field of inquiry that no longer centered on a single environment, but instead relied on the coordination of multiple external systems. What had begun as a contained onboard incident was now being interpreted through geographically separated points of reference, each contributing partial information without forming a unified or continuous picture of movement. In maritime investigations that extend beyond the boundaries of a vessel itself, the transition from contained operational review to regional coordination often introduces a different kind of uncertainty, one shaped not by absence alone, but by the fragmentation of information across distance, jurisdiction, and time. Standard arrival records maintained at designated Caribbean stops were subsequently reviewed to determine whether any irregular passenger movement had been documented during scheduled docking procedures, with particular attention given to disembarkation logs, port security checks, and passenger manifest confirmations recorded during routine clearance operations. These records were designed to verify continuity between shipboard presence and shore access, yet their function depended on procedural compliance at each location, meaning that consistency across jurisdictions was essential for establishing reliable traceability. In practice, however, each port maintained its own administrative structure, and the integration of these records into a single, investigative framework required careful cross-referencing rather than direct alignment. Even minor discrepancies in timing standards, reporting procedures, or documentation methods could complicate efforts to establish uninterrupted continuity across multiple destinations connected only by the ship's itinerary. Separate from official port documentation, sporadic accounts originating from different shoreline locations began circulating, each describing uncertain observations that could not be consistently matched to any verified identity or timeline, and each emerging independently without a shared point of origin or corroborating sequence. These reports varied in specificity and reliability, often lacking the structural details required for confirmation, such as exact timing, sustained observation, or supporting documentation from local authorities. Within investigative processes, such accounts are typically recorded as leads rather than conclusions, forming a secondary layer of information that remains open but unresolved unless later substantiated by additional evidence. In cases extending across multiple coastal regions, unverified reports frequently accumulate faster than they can be conclusively evaluated, particularly when descriptions remain broad enough to overlap with unrelated observations occurring within densely travelled tourist and port environments. Different territorial authorities engage with the developing inquiry under their own procedural frameworks, resulting in variations in how incoming reports were processed, interpreted, and archived, as jurisdictional boundaries influence not only the flow of information, but also the criteria used to evaluate its relevance. In multi-region maritime cases, this fragmentation is a structural reality rather than an anomaly, since no single authority holds complete jurisdiction over events that span international waters and multiple coastal regions. As a result, investigative coordination often depends on information exchange protocols that are inherently asynchronous, with delays and interpretive differences shaping the overall picture that gradually emerges. Some agencies prioritized immediate operational relevance, while others focused more heavily on documentary consistency, creating parallel investigative pathways that did not always converge at the same pace or through the same evidentiary standards. Attempts to align incoming information into a structured sequence encountered repeated disruption, as discrepancies in time references and location details prevented the formation of a continuous narrative thread, leaving investigators with parallel strands of information that could not be easily merged into a single coherent timeline. Some reports referenced similar geographic areas but differed in descriptive detail, while others aligned in timing but diverged in environmental context, creating overlaps that suggested proximity without confirming connection. In such conditions, investigative work becomes an exercise in filtering, where each piece of information must be evaluated not only for what it claims, but also for how it relates, or fails to relate, to other available data points. The challenge is compounded by the fact that maritime movement itself is fluid and transitional, with passengers, workers, tourists, and local populations constantly intersecting in environments where short-lived encounters rarely produce lasting documentation. No singular directional pattern emerged from the expanding set of regional inputs, leaving the investigative map defined more by separation of points than by any connecting trajectory, as each piece of information remained isolated within its own context without forming a verifiable chain of movement across space or time. This absence of convergence did not indicate inactivity, but rather reflected the structural difficulty of reconstructing events across multiple jurisdictions where documentation standards, reporting timing, and observational reliability varied significantly. Over time, the accumulation of non-aligned inputs created a distributed field of uncertainty that resisted consolidation into a definitive path. Rather than narrowing the possibilities, the growing volume of disconnected information often expanded the interpretive boundaries of the case, introducing additional questions without resolving earlier uncertainties. Over time, a limited number of recurring descriptions would begin to draw renewed attention, as later accounts suggested the possibility that fragments of the case had persisted beyond the period of initial search activity. Years later, 3 separate sightings that reignited the case. Several years after the original disappearance had transitioned into an unresolved investigative record, new accounts began to surface that appeared to reintroduce the case into public and procedural attention through isolated, unrelated points in time, each emerging independently and separated by geography, circumstance, and the absence of any connecting evidentiary chain that could confirm continuity with earlier events. In cases where initial investigations have already concluded their primary operational phases, such later developments do not reopen the original timeline in a direct sense, but instead create secondary layers of interpretive uncertainty that exist parallel to the established record. These secondary layers are not extensions of the original investigation, but rather informational echoes that exist outside its formal structure, shaped entirely by retrospective recognition rather than contemporaneous verification. One of the earliest of these later reports originated from an independent witness account describing a possible visual recognition that could not be verified against any existing identification or confirmed travel documentation, leaving the observation in a category of unconfirmed perception rather than substantiated identification. The report itself, as it was later referenced in investigative discussions, remained dependent on memory-based recall and situational interpretation, both of which are known to vary significantly in reliability depending on environmental conditions, distance, and the brevity of observation. In such circumstances, the absence of supporting material evidence means that the account must be treated as an isolated data point, rather than a confirmed extension of the original case timeline. Investigators evaluating such reports typically consider not only the content of the claim, but also the conditions under which recognition occurred, including lighting, duration of observation, and contextual familiarity, all of which significantly influence identification accuracy in real-world environments. A second account emerged from a geographically distant location, presenting another unverified observation that shared limited descriptive overlap with earlier reports, while remaining disconnected from any confirmed investigative sequence, introducing a separate instance of claimed recognition that existed entirely outside the original operational and temporal framework of the disappearance. This report, like the first, was recorded through indirect channels and later evaluated in relation to existing case documentation, yet it lacked the procedural anchors, such as time-stamped verification, corroborating witnesses or physical evidence, that would allow it to be integrated into a continuous investigative narrative. Instead, it remained a standalone claim situated outside the established evidentiary structure. In cases involving long-term unresolved disappearances, geographically separated reports often emerge independently without awareness of one another, creating the appearance of pattern overlap even when no underlying connection can be demonstrated through verifiable means. A third separate report added further complexity to the case, introducing another instance of claimed recognition that intensified public interest without producing corroborative evidence capable of linking the accounts together, thereby reinforcing the fragmented nature of post-event observations associated with the case. Unlike structured investigative findings, these later reports did not arise from coordinated inquiry, but from independent and unrelated circumstances, each shaped by individual perception and contextual ambiguity. When considered in isolation, each account carries its own internal consistency. However, when placed alongside one another, they resist alignment into a single coherent pattern of movement or continuity. This structural incompatibility is significant in investigative evaluation, as it suggests that each observation may exist as an independent perceptual event rather than part of a shared trajectory. When examined collectively, the reported details revealed inconsistencies in timing, environment, and contextual clarity that prevented the formation of a unified interpretive framework across the three accounts, leaving investigators and observers with parallel claims that could not be reconciled into a single verified trajectory. Differences in environmental conditions, reported circumstances, and temporal separation further complicated efforts to evaluate whether any underlying connection existed between the sightings, as each account appeared to originate from distinct situational contexts without demonstrable overlap. In analytical terms, such fragmentation typically indicates either coincidental misidentification or unrelated observational events, though neither conclusion can be definitively proven without supporting verification. The absence of shared corroborating detail across all accounts reinforces the structural limitation of retrospective identification in cases where no continuous observational record exists. Beyond investigative evaluation, the persistence of these reports also reflects the broader dynamics of human pattern recognition, where isolated claims can acquire amplified significance when viewed through the lens of unresolved cases, particularly when the original disappearance remains widely known and emotionally salient within public memory. In such environments, recognition is not purely a function of direct observation, but is also influenced by prior exposure to imagery, narratives, and repeated references that shape how individuals interpret ambiguous visual information. This does not invalidate the sincerity of the accounts, but it introduces an additional layer of interpretive complexity that must be considered when assessing their evidentiary value. Media attention and public discussion surrounding these later accounts contributed to a renewed visibility of the case, shaping perception in ways that extended beyond what could be substantiated through formal investigative verification, as the reappearance of unresolved claims years after the original disappearance naturally draws interpretive focus back into public discourse. This renewed attention often amplifies the significance of unverified reports, not through evidentiary strength, but through repetition and circulation across informational channels, where uncertainty itself becomes a form of sustained narrative presence. As a result, the case maintained a level of visibility that exceeded its evidentiary progression, remaining active in public awareness despite the absence of confirmable updates. Over time, the case became not only an investigative subject, but also a recurring reference point within broader discussions of unresolved maritime disappearances. Despite the renewed attention generated by these accounts, the absence of definitive corroboration ensured that each report remained suspended between possibility and uncertainty, leaving the underlying question unresolved as it moved into deeper analytical interpretation. Media amplification, public obsession, and the transformation of the case. Long after formal search activity had diminished in intensity, the disappearance continued to circulate through public memory in ways that extended far beyond the original investigative framework, gradually transforming from a maritime missing person case into a recurring subject of international fascination sustained through repetition, reinterpretation, and unresolved uncertainty. Unlike investigations that conclude through confirmed recovery or definitive evidence, unresolved disappearances often persist in a suspended state where the absence of closure becomes central to the story itself, allowing each resurfacing mention, interview, or retrospective feature to renew attention without materially changing the known facts. Over time, the case no longer existed solely within official records or investigative archives, but within a broader cultural space shaped by memory, speculation, and continuing public curiosity. This transition marks a structural shift in how unresolved events behave over time, moving from procedural documentation into narrative continuity sustained by collective attention, rather than investigative development. Television broadcasts, newspaper coverage, and widely distributed photographs gradually expanded awareness of the case beyond maritime and regional audiences, transforming a localized disappearance into an internationally recognized mystery whose visibility extended across multiple generations of media coverage. In the years following the disappearance, missing persons segments, interview programs, and investigative features repeatedly revisited the case, often emphasizing the unresolved nature of the timeline and the later reports suggesting possible sightings. The circulation of photographs played a particularly important role in sustaining public recognition, as repeated exposure to the same images reinforced familiarity and allowed the case to remain identifiable even as years passed. Within public-facing media environments, unresolved cases frequently derive continuity not from new evidence, but from the enduring recognizability of their central figures and unanswered questions. This repeated visual reinforcement contributes to a form of informational persistence, where recognition outlasts investigative progression. Repeated retellings of the case over successive years subtly altered the emphasis placed on certain details, as unresolved elements increasingly became the focal point of public interpretation and discussion. Particular moments within the timeline, such as the final known sightings aboard the vessel, the unexplained overnight gap, and the later unverified reports, began to receive disproportionate attention compared to procedural or administrative details that carried less emotional or narrative weight. This selective reinforcement is common in long-running unresolved cases, where public memory gradually condenses complex investigations into a smaller number of symbolic moments that become culturally associated with the mystery itself. As details are repeated across documentaries, articles, and discussions, the distinction between established information and interpretive emphasis can become increasingly difficult for general audiences to separate, allowing narrative structure to gradually override evidentiary structure in public understanding. Public fascination surrounding unexplained disappearances at sea contributed additional symbolic weight to the case, particularly within cultural perceptions of cruise ships as controlled environments moving through vast and largely inaccessible spaces. Maritime disappearances often generate a unique form of unease because they occur within environments that appear structured and observable, while simultaneously existing within immense open regions where recovery, reconstruction, and verification become inherently difficult. Cruise vessels, in particular, occupy an unusual psychological position in public imagination. Temporary self-contained communities surrounded by isolation, movement, and international boundaries. In such settings, the idea that a person could disappear without definitive explanation creates a tension between perceived security and practical uncertainty, a contrast that has historically contributed to enduring public interest in unresolved maritime cases. This tension is amplified by the inherent contradiction between technological sophistication on board and the physical vastness of the surrounding environment. Online discussion platforms and later documentary coverage introduced decentralized forms of interpretation in which speculation, fragmented evidence, and personal analysis often circulated alongside verified information without clear distinction, creating parallel narratives that evolved independently of formal investigative conclusions. As internet forums, video essays, and discussion communities expanded, the case entered an environment where information was continuously revisited, reanalyzed, and redistributed by individuals operating outside official investigative structures. In these spaces, isolated details could gain amplified significance through repetition alone, while theories unsupported by evidence sometimes achieved a visibility comparable to documented facts simply because they aligned with public curiosity or narrative expectation. This decentralization of interpretation altered the way unresolved cases functioned publicly, shifting authority away from singular investigative narratives and toward a dispersed network of competing interpretations that evolve independently over time. As digital engagement increased, the case also became subject to cyclical rediscovery, where periods of relative quiet were followed by renewed interest triggered by documentaries, anniversaries, or resurfacing discussions that reintroduced the story to new audiences unfamiliar with its historical context. Each cycle of rediscovery did not alter the underlying evidentiary record, but it did reshape how that record was perceived, as newer audiences encountered the case without the contextual grounding of earlier investigative phases. This generational reintroduction contributed to a layered perception structure, where the same core events are repeatedly reinterpreted through shifting cultural and informational environments. Gradually, the disappearance evolved from an active investigative event into a persistent, unresolved narrative whose endurance was sustained less by new evidence than by the continuing absence of definitive explanation. Each resurfacing discussion, anniversary feature, or renewed examination reinforced the unusual longevity of the case, not because the central mystery had become clearer, but because its unanswered structure remained intact despite years of analysis and exposure. In many unresolved disappearances, public attention eventually diminishes as investigative possibilities narrow over time, yet certain cases persist because they resist reduction into a singular explanatory framework. The combination of an enclosed maritime setting, fragmented later reports, and the absence of conclusive physical evidence allowed this case to remain suspended between competing possibilities without fully settling into any one interpretation. The longer the case remained suspended between recurring speculation and incomplete evidence, the more its unresolved structure encouraged competing explanations that attempted to account for what the investigation itself could never fully establish. Conflicting theories, psychological evidence, and the question of survival. Accumulated investigative material from preceding phases gradually converged into a framework of interpretive uncertainty, where competing explanations began to define the structure of analysis rather than any single confirmed trajectory, and where the absence of definitive resolution shifted the focus of inquiry from event reconstruction toward evidentiary interpretation. In this stage of examination, the case no longer exists as a linear sequence of moments, but as a collection of incomplete informational layers, each contributing partial clarity, while simultaneously reinforcing the boundaries of what cannot be established with certainty. The investigative challenge, therefore, becomes less about discovering a single missing piece, and more about determining whether the existing fragments can ever be arranged into a configuration that fully accounts for every known circumstance surrounding the disappearance. One of the principal investigative considerations involves the possibility of abduction, or maritime trafficking activity, a framework discussed in relation to known vulnerabilities in high-traffic international passenger environments, though without direct evidentiary confirmation in this specific case, meaning that its relevance emerges primarily from general risk assessments rather than case-specific proof. Such analysis typically focuses on structural conditions that may allow unauthorized transfer or concealment within complex maritime systems, yet in the absence of verified indicators, these considerations remain theoretical constructs rather than substantiated conclusions. Within investigative practice, this theory is evaluated not for what it proves, but for what it fails to eliminate within the boundaries of available information. Cruise vessels operating across international routes create temporary environments where large passenger populations, rotating personnel, and transitional port activity intersect within compressed periods of time, conditions that investigators in maritime cases sometimes examine closely when assessing unexplained disappearances. Even so, the distinction between theoretical vulnerability and demonstrable occurrence remains critically important, particularly in cases where physical evidence capable of confirming coercion or organized involvement has never been established. Alternative evaluation focuses on the possibility of an accidental outcome occurring outside documented observation points, assessed through structural and environmental constraints inherent to large-scale maritime vessels operating in open water conditions, where multiple levels, exterior access areas, and variable visibility conditions introduce inherent limitations in continuous observation. This line of interpretation remains grounded in the physical realities of ship design and operational movement, yet it too is constrained by the absence of a confirmed sequence that would allow precise reconstruction of any such event. As with other frameworks, the challenge lies not in identifying plausibility, but in bridging the gap between plausibility and verifiable occurrence. Maritime environments are uniquely resistant to complete reconstruction because the surrounding environment itself rapidly absorbs physical evidence, while darkness, weather conditions, and continuous ship movement reduce the likelihood that isolated incidents occurring outside populated observation zones will produce reliable witnesses or recoverable traces. In this context, uncertainty is sustained not only by what is unknown, but by the physical nature of the environment in which the disappearance occurred. Another interpretive line considers the theoretical possibility of voluntary disappearance, approached cautiously within investigative practice due to the absence of corroborating behavioral, logistical, or documented indicators supporting such a conclusion. and treated primarily as a procedural category rather than an evidenced pathway. This framework is often included in structured case evaluations to ensure completeness of analysis, yet its application depends heavily on contextual behavioral patterns and supporting data that, in this instance, remain insufficient to establish meaningful alignment with known circumstances. As a result, it functions more as a defined investigative boundary than as an active explanatory model. Cases involving unexplained disappearances frequently require investigators to account for every broad category of possibility, even when available evidence does not strongly support one direction over another, because the exclusion of any category prematurely risks narrowing interpretation before all variables have been adequately considered. Interpretation of fragmented reports and delayed witness accounts introduces methodological limitations tied to memory reliability, perceptual variance, and the temporal distance between observation and formal documentation, all of which influence how later information is weighted within the broader evidentiary framework. In cases where accounts emerge after significant time has passed, the distinction between recollection and reconstruction becomes increasingly relevant as human memory is shaped not only by original perception, but also by subsequent exposure to external narratives and reinterpretations. These factors do not invalidate such accounts, but they do require careful contextualization within a structured analytical approach. Investigators evaluating long-running disappearances often distinguish between information that independently originates from direct observation and information that may have been unintentionally shaped by repeated public circulation of case details over extended periods of time. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more difficult it becomes to isolate memory from accumulated interpretation. Comparative assessment of all proposed explanations reveals persistent gaps in evidentiary continuity, preventing any single theory from achieving full reconciliation with the totality of known and unverified data points, and leaving each interpretive model partially supported yet ultimately incomplete when measured against the full scope of available information. In this state of analysis, each theory occupies a conditional position, plausible within certain constraints, yet insufficient when required to account for every unresolved element simultaneously. The result is not convergence, but sustained analytical separation between competing frameworks. Certain aspects of the case appear to align with one interpretation while conflicting with another, creating a pattern in which explanatory strength in one area often corresponds with evidentiary weakness in another. Rather than narrowing toward a definitive conclusion over time, the case instead demonstrates how unresolved disappearances can accumulate complexity as additional interpretations emerge without resolving the original informational gaps. Even after all frameworks of analysis are applied, the case ultimately remains defined less by what has been resolved than by what continues to resist definitive understanding.